All right, hello everyone. This is my presentation for History 325 Immigration. I chose to do my presentation on the Indian boarding schools and not necessarily the brutality, but how effective they were. And what I'm using to measure that is not the number of Indians or native peoples that chose to revert back to their ways, but the number of people that were successfully assimilated into American culture and eventually gain the title of the American. I'm going to argue that it wasn't schools were not particularly effective because they kept having to change their means and their ways of education and the things that they were teaching in order to get people to assimilate. Eventually, we see in the 1940s, 1950s that the Indians are starting to get a modicum of respect and close to the title of being an American. The first source I've chosen is a writing by Jonathan Harrison, and it's called The Latest Studies on Indian Reservations. It was written in the late 1880s, and it chronicles his experiences visiting different Indian reservations. His standards were looking at how their proximity to Americans, the quality of the Indian agent, and their access basically to alcohol and to ways that they could be their moral character would be questioned. So anything that could call in one could call into question was not good. Also, the numbers and the numbers of students retained and the number of students that were going back. That So one thing that he did really stress was the techniques and the retention rates for keeping Indians in school. One reservation chose to limit the rations of the entire family if the students did not show up in school. So if that was a retention technique, one might just think about how students were actually being treated in school. The next source is a series of letters and testimony in Congress in the late 1880s arguing about the efficacy of the Indian schools. And in it, congressmen were deflecting and questioning the testimony of the people that were on the ground, mostly because, well, they were female, but two, they seemed to not or have too much of an appreciation for frontier life and not have enough of an appreciation for civilized city American life, and that is they were two folk. Well, the quality of the education was based on the quality of the Indian agent or the American administering the education, not necessarily the quality of the Indian students themselves, which is really something to kind of note. Their standards for failure were limiting the number of students that went back into their native ways. But one might argue that it's rather tough to do that, to undo generations of teachings in one generation. My third source is the Office of Indian Affairs Manual on Teaching. In 1898, all that was really laid out was a structure of education, the superintendent, the teachers, down to the students. The curriculum wasn't really stressed, and the nutrition and health of the students wasn't really stressed. There was just a measure that says, well, basically, if the students sufficiently misbehave, we reserve the right to send them back to the reservation and basically kick them out of school. In 1913, we see a little bit of a difference. At this point, you have nutrition standards. You're starting to see vaccination standards. and you're actually starting to see a means. There are references to ways that Indians can gain citizenship. So we're starting to see that maybe 50 years later, from the 1880s, that we're starting to get some form of the Indians being considered American. And then finally, is my last source is the same manual in 1941. And here we have full vaccination requirements, we have full health requirements, we have curriculum standards, we have record reportings as far as grades and reports, we have established procedures for going from grade to grade. So this is finally where we see that the Indians are being fully integrated into American society, at least in some form. They're getting a technical education. Their needs are their daily needs are being met. Versus back in the 1880s, there really were no standards. So finally, I need to talk about the legacy of American immigration. And as the Indians show, it's really kind of complex. It's great if you were white and essentially had money or had something that Americans wanted. However, if that was not the case, we see that immigrants are often pushed to the lowest rungs of society and forced to do things that nobody else wants. So I would say the legacy of American immigration is kind of a dichotomy in that, if there was something that those in power wanted, then you were considered an American. If you had something or were considered a threat to those in power, namely elite whites, then you had a fair amount of issues, and you were most likely considered not an American and had to go through many years of trials in order to gain that status. Some would say even decades or generations. So thank you for your time, and I hope you all do well.